The eviction notice did not land with a crash. It slid smoothly across the Thanksgiving table, stopping between the turkey and the cranberry sauce like just another side dish. My father smiled like a man fulfilling a moral duty. My brother sat completely still. They miscalculated the only person in the room who understood how dirty paperwork actually worked. Seconds later, a heavy knock on the door turned our family dinner into a sudden collapse. My name is Isla Carter. I am 34 years old, and I sat at the head of the long mahogany dining table inside the historic Savannah townhouse. I had lived within these ancient, groaning walls for 3 long years. I surrendered my independence, my social life, and my quiet evenings to become a full-time caregiver. I spent those years measuring out blood pressure medications, adjusting oxygen valves, and watching my grandfather, Amos Carter, slowly fade from this world. Tonight, the grand dining room smelled of roasted turkey, browned butter sage, and the expensive perfumes of our guests. Yet, beneath it all, I could still detect the faint, lingering scent of clinical antiseptic that had defined my life for 36 months. The massive crystal chandelier above us cast a warm, golden glow over a dinner party I had never wanted to attend. My father, Dean Carter, insisted on hosting a massive crowd for Thanksgiving this year. He orchestrated the event with the precision of a stage director, treating the family holiday like a press conference. To his right sat my mother, Vivian Carter. She wore an emerald silk dress that draped perfectly over her shoulders, her posture rigid, her smile fixed and entirely devoid of warmth. To his left sat my older brother, Mason Carter, wearing a custom suit that could not hide the nervous twitch in his jaw. The rest of the table was filled with Dean and Vivian's hand-picked audience. There were 2 wealthy local real estate donors who regularly funded my mother's charity galas and foundation events. Next to them sat a sharp-suited man acting as a representative for Mason's private lender. A man whose presence at a family dinner felt incredibly inappropriate. The remaining seats held a few familiar socialite faces, people who drank our expensive wine and nodded along to my father's boastful anecdotes. They were perfectly blind to the rot eating away at the foundation of our family. This was not a holiday meal meant for gratitude. It was a staged exhibition of prosperity, dominance, and control. We were halfway through the main course when the subtle shift in the room's atmosphere happened. The casual chatter about coastal property developments and upcoming winter galas began to die down. Dean wiped his mouth slowly with a white linen napkin, folded it neatly, and placed it beside his plate. He reached into the inner breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a thick cream envelope. He placed the envelope on the polished wood of the table. With a slow, deliberate movement of his index finger, he pushed it down the length of the table. The paper slid silently past the silver gravy boat, past the crystal wine glasses, and came to a dead stop right next to my dinner plate. I stared at the blank paper. The room grew unnaturally quiet. The clinking of silverware ceased. "You have 10 days to vacate the premises," Dean said. His voice was perfectly level, stripped of any paternal warmth or hesitation. He spoke to me as if I were a troublesome tenant who had finally overstayed a very generous welcome. "Mason needs a clean asset to start over." I looked from the sealed envelope to my father. He was casually cutting a piece of white meat, not even bothering to hold my gaze. He felt entirely justified in his action. He felt completely safe. Vivian chimed in from across the table, playing her part flawlessly. She did not raise her voice. She never raised her voice. She took a delicate sip of her white wine, placed the delicate glass down, and offered me a smile of polite, calculated cruelty. "Be a mature adult about this, Isla," she instructed me, her tone dripping with polished condescension. "This is a business decision. It is not emotional." I shifted my attention away from my parents and looked at Mason. My older brother could not even bring himself to look at me. He sat hunched over his expensive plate, his face pale and glistening with a thin, cold layer of sweat. He was not eating. He was staring down at his lap, where his phone rested on his thigh. His thumbs twitched rapidly. He kept refreshing his screen, waiting for a message or a financial confirmation that absolutely had to happen tonight. He needed me out of this house so desperately that his hands physically shook under the table. I reached out and picked up the thick cream envelope. The paper felt heavy and textured, a stark contrast to the cheap, dirty intent hidden inside it. I broke the wax seal with my thumbnail and pulled out the single sheet of paper. It was a formal, legally binding notice of eviction. My eyes scanned the dense legal jargon, the bold black headings, and finally settled at the very bottom of the page. I looked closely at the authorization signature. I looked at the blue notary stamp pressed into the bottom right corner. A cold, incredibly sharp clarity washed over my entire body. In my line of work, I stared at hundreds of property documents every single week. I hunted for inconsistencies for a living. I knew exactly what a legitimate legal filing looked like, and more importantly, I knew exactly what a desperate, rushed forgery looked like. The notary stamp on this eviction notice was entirely wrong. The ink distribution was too perfect, clearly printed directly from a high-resolution digital file, rather than physically stamped by human hands. The authorization signature belonged to a shell entity I recognized immediately. It was the exact same shell company from a massive fraudulent housing claim I had reviewed just 2 days ago. It was a sloppy fake. My family had used the exact same dirty paperwork network to try and force me out of my grandfather's house. They thought I was just the quiet, obedient daughter who stayed behind to change bedpans and administer medication. They completely miscalculated the only person in the room who actually understood how real estate fraud operated at a federal level. I folded the paper precisely along its original crease. I slipped it back into the cream envelope and placed it neatly beside my fork. I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not throw my wine glass across the room or demand a tearful explanation from the people who were supposed to love me. I looked directly at my father, letting the heavy silence stretch until the wealthy donors and the private lender shifted uncomfortably in their mahogany chairs. "If you all want to do this fast," I said, keeping my voice low and terrifyingly calm, dropping the temperature of the entire room, "then let us do it fast." Dean frowned deeply, visibly confused by my complete lack of hysterics. He opened his mouth, likely preparing to deliver another scripted line about familial duty and necessary sacrifice for the greater good of the Carter name. He never got the chance to speak. 3 seconds later, the solid oak front door of the townhouse shuddered violently. A deafening series of blows echoed through the grand foyer, shaking the heavy framed portraits hanging on the hallway walls. The sound ripped through the quiet dining room like a physical blow. Before anyone could even stand up from their chairs, the front door gave way with a sickening crack, heavy. Tactical boots hit the hardwood floor in unison. Men and women wearing dark jackets with large yellow letters printed across their backs flooded the hallway. Federal agents. They swarmed the grand entryway in seconds, their voices barking loud. Sharp commands that instantly shattered the pristine illusion of our Thanksgiving dinner. They carried metal clipboards, empty evidence bags, and a freshly signed federal search warrant. Dean dropped his silver fork. It clattered loudly against his fine china plate. The color completely drained from his face as he stared in absolute horror at the armed agents entering his carefully curated sanctuary. In his immense arrogance, he had wanted a room full of respectable witnesses to watch my humiliation. He had absolutely no idea that by serving me that forged document, a document directly tied to a massive federal fraud ring, right in front of a table full of people, he had just handed the authorities the final piece of evidence they needed. The raid had officially begun, and the elaborate trap my father built for me had just snapped completely shut on his own neck. 3 years ago, my grandfather Amos Carter suffered a mild stroke that fundamentally altered the trajectory of our entire family. He had always been a towering figure in my life, a man of incredibly sharp intellect and unshakable resolve. The stroke did not destroy his brilliant mind, but it betrayed his aging body. His physical decline was not a sudden, dramatic plunge, but a long, agonizingly slow descent. When he was finally discharged from the inpatient rehabilitation center, the family held a brief, intensely uncomfortable meeting in the downstairs parlor. Dean, Vivian, and Mason all stared at the antique Persian rugs, offering a chorus of vague excuses about their demanding executive schedules, crucial upcoming business quarters, and fragile emotional capacities. None of them were willing to disrupt their perfectly curated, affluent lives to learn how to change a bedpan or monitor an oxygen tank. I did not argue with them, nor did I beg for their help. I simply packed up my quiet, independent apartment across town, surrendered my lease, and moved into the guest bedroom down the hall from his master suite. I became his full-time world. I did not abandon my professional career. However, I absolutely could not afford to lose my grip on the outside world. I fiercely maintained my full-time position at Marrow Field Recovery Services. It was a rigorous, deeply analytical job that required my complete focus. Our firm functioned as a highly specialized auditing unit for massive federal housing reimbursement programs. My specific daily role involved dissecting thousands of pages of paperwork submitted by external contractors and corporate property developers, constantly hunting for the subtle, microscopic signs of systemic fraud. I spent 40 hours a week staring at dual monitors, cross-referencing tax identification numbers, meticulously analyzing doctored site photographs, and tracing phantom supply chains to nowhere. I learned how to look for the cold lies hidden beneath the surface of perfectly legitimate-looking insurance claims. Every single evening, I brought my heavy work laptop back to the historic townhouse. I worked late into the night from a small wooden desk in the corner of my grandfather's room, the harsh blue light of the screen illuminating his sleeping face while his medical machinery hummed in the background. While I lived in a confined universe defined by sterile antiseptic wipes, rigid physical therapy schedules, and the rhythmic hiss of a breathing machine, my parents lived in a completely different reality. My father, Dean, was entirely obsessed with maintaining his public image as a paragon of local enterprise. He spent his days wearing immaculate tailored suits, aggressively shaking hands at regional commerce board meetings, and having expensive lunches with city planners. He expertly projected the noble, somber aura of a loving son who oversaw his dying father's twilight years with absolute grace and dignity. The reality behind closed doors was that he never spent a single dollar of his own money on care services and never sacrificed a single hour of his own sleep to help me. My mother, Vivian, operated on an identical plane of grand delusion. She was a permanent, glowing fixture in the city's high society, constantly organizing lavish charity galas and speaking passionately at podiums about the vital importance of community care and familial bonds. Yet, she treated the upstairs level of our own townhouse like a toxic quarantine zone. She would not risk wrinkling her expensive silk designer dresses to help me lift Amos out of his wheelchair so he could bathe. To my parents, the messy, visceral reality of illness and dying was simply an unsightly social blemish to be hidden away, completely outsourced to my tired hands so they would not have to look at it. There is absolutely no glamour in watching someone you deeply love lose their physical autonomy. It is a grinding, relentless marathon of physical and emotional exhaustion. I was the one who learned how to properly clean and dress a severe pressure ulcer to prevent a lethal infection. I was the one who managed the incredibly complex matrix of his daily medications, setting loud alarms on my phone for 2 a.m, 4 a.m, and 6 a.m just to administer pills. I was the one who spent countless freezing nights sleeping slumped against the hallway wall, sitting on the hard wooden floor, because I was too terrified to go to my own bed in case his breathing suddenly stopped in the dark. I sacrificed my own comfort, my relationships, and my youth to ensure Amos Carter lived his final years with unbroken human dignity. I made sure his clothes were always clean, his hair was neatly combed, and his mind was engaged in conversation, even when his body completely refused to cooperate. I gave him the fundamental respect his own son and daughter flatly refused to offer. My older brother Mason treated his familial visits like mandatory, highly annoying corporate check-ins. He would appear in the bedroom doorway roughly once every 4 weeks, usually reeking of expensive cologne and manic, nervous energy. He almost never sat down in the visitor chair. He would pace relentlessly at the foot of the bed, and loudly pitch his latest grandiose investment schemes to a man who could barely sit up unassisted. Mason threw around trendy industry buzzwords like cheap confetti. He talked endlessly about heritage renovation projects, adaptive community housing initiatives, and high-yield urban real estate redevelopment. He painted himself as a brilliant visionary builder of the future. But the absolute truth of Mason's hollow character was always evident in his actions. During those rare, painfully brief visits, he never once stayed long enough to carry an empty water glass down to the kitchen sink. He never once offered to clear away a discarded medicine tray. He desperately wanted the financial legacy and power of the Carter name, but he was entirely repulsed by the actual, grueling work required to honor it. As the grueling months slowly bled into long years, a fundamental, sickening shift occurred in how my family perceived me. I ceased to be a daughter or a sister in their eyes. I quietly devolved into a highly functional piece of household furniture. I became something reliable and useful when they required a medical update for their wealthy social circles, but I remained entirely invisible when they simply did not want to acknowledge their own profound selfishness. The disrespect they showed me was almost never a loud argument or a violent screaming match. It was far more insidious than that. It was a steady, quiet, daily degradation of my worth as a human being. I would often overhear Vivian talking on the phone in the parlor, sighing softly as she referred to me to her friends as the girl who stayed behind, deliberately framing my intense devotion as a tragic lack of personal ambition or career drive. When distant acquaintances or neighbors praised my sacrifice, Dean would casually brush the compliments off, stating firmly that I was simply doing my expected duty as a woman of the family. Mason was easily the cruelest of them all. He would lean casually against the antique oak banister, survey the incredibly valuable historic property around us, and joke with a cold smirk that I was nothing more than a glorified night watchman, just guarding the primary asset for the people who would eventually put it to real use. I absorbed every single dismissive comment, every rolled eye, and every subtle insult in absolute silence. What they completely failed to comprehend was that my silence was never submission. It was pure, unfiltered observation. Working at Marrow Field Recovery Services had systematically trained my brain to recognize hidden patterns of deception, and I soon realized that the harsh, cynical lessons of my profession applied perfectly to the blood relatives walking through my own hallways. I learned that the most destructive and dangerous predators in the world do not kick down your front door or scream violent threats in your face. The truly dangerous ones operate entirely in the bright light of day. They use pristine, cleanly typed, legally binding paperwork. They speak in soft, highly reasonable, impeccably polite voices. They expertly leverage their high social standing, their familiar faces, and their polished community reputations to completely camouflage their ruthless, greedy motives. My family was no different from the faceless corporate fraudsters I hunted on my computer screen every single day. They were just hiding their crimes behind the sacred concept of family. This toxic dynamic was exactly why the Thanksgiving dinner unfolded the way it did. My parents and my brother had spent 3 long years watching me endure. They watched me swallow my bone-deep exhaustion, bite my tongue to keep the peace, and prioritize my grandfather's care over my own righteous vindication. They had completely convinced themselves that I was a weak, passive victim, a broken woman who would always fold under extreme pressure just to avoid causing a public scene. They truly believed that if they presented me with a terrifying legal document in front of a dining room full of wealthy, judgmental strangers, the sheer, crushing weight of the social humiliation would instantly force me to surrender my ground. They thought I would quietly pack my bags, hand over the multi-million-dollar property without a fight, and walk away into the cold night so they could finally execute their massive financial schemes. They believed I would just swallow my pride one last time and disappear. That profound, breathtakingly arrogant underestimation was the single greatest mistake they would ever make in their miserable lives. The revelation did not arrive in a dramatic flash of lightning. It crept into my life through the blue glare of my dual monitors on a rainy Tuesday evening. I was sitting at my desk at the Marrow Field Recovery Services office, pulling a mandatory overtime shift to clear a massive backlog of post-hurricane reimbursement claims. My eyes were burning from staring at endless rows of spreadsheet data. The federal government had allocated hundreds of millions of dollars to rebuild coastal communities devastated by the recent storm seasons, and my department was the final barrier between those relief funds and the pockets of opportunistic vultures. I opened a file belonging to a mid-sized contracting firm requesting a payout of $250,000 for structural repairs on 5 residential properties. The paperwork looked pristine on the surface. The invoices were neatly itemized down to the last box of galvanized nails. But my brain, trained to detect anomalies in an ocean of numbers, caught a subtle repetition. The primary billing address for this specific contractor, and suddenly for 3 others I had flagged earlier in the week, was identical. I typed the address into the county property database to verify the zoning. The result that populated the screen made my blood run cold. It was the carriage house, the small, converted brick structure sitting directly behind our own family estate, a building that currently housed nothing but old patio furniture and a broken lawnmower. I stopped breathing for a moment. I leaned closer to the screen, the cursor blinking mockingly against the stark white background. I opened a new search window and began running the names of the managing partners listed on those contractor applications. That single thread began to unravel a massive, rotting tapestry. Over the next 48 hours, I barely slept. I bypassed the standard auditing software and dove directly into the state corporate registry. I found a labyrinth of shell companies, limited liability corporations registered to dead-end mailboxes and vacant lots. They all shared different names, different registered agents, and different colorful logos, but the digital breadcrumbs all led back to a single centralized source. They were all subcontractors feeding into my brother's flagship real estate initiative. Mason called his grand vision a community housing recovery model. He had spent the last 2 years loudly boasting about it to anyone who would listen. The prospectus he handed out at networking events promised to buy up storm-damaged properties in low-income neighborhoods, renovate them using local labor, and return them to the community at affordable rates. It sounded noble. It sounded like the kind of visionary leadership the Carter family prided themselves on. The digital files told a completely different story. I pulled up the mandatory inspection photographs submitted to release the federal funds. At first glance, they showed newly hung drywall, freshly poured concrete foundations, and upgraded electrical panels. But when I magnified the images and ran them through a basic metadata extractor, the lie became glaringly obvious. They were using the exact same photographs for multiple properties. They simply cropped the edges, applied different digital filters, or mirrored the image horizontally to make it look like a different room. The official municipal inspection signatures were crude digital splices, literally cut and pasted from public records onto the approval forms. Even worse, when I cross-referenced the geographic parcel codes listed on the reimbursement requests, more than half of them did not match the actual property owners. Mason was claiming federal relief money to rebuild houses he did not even own. He was bleeding the recovery fund dry, pocketing hundreds of thousands of dollars for phantom construction work. My first instinct was to assume Mason was simply incompetent. I desperately wanted to believe he had hired a crooked project manager and was too lazy to oversee the daily operations. But as I dug deeper into the financial architecture of the scheme, the shadows of my parents began to emerge. My father was a cautious man. Dean never put his actual signature on a direct funding application. He was far too smart to leave his fingerprints on the murder weapon, but his presence was everywhere in the peripheral documentation. I found his name buried in the meeting minutes of supposed advisory boards. I found copies of letters he had written on his official corporate letterhead, providing robust financial guarantees that allowed Mason's empty shell companies to secure massive lines of credit. Dean was leveraging his pristine reputation in the local business community to vouch for a complete fabrication. He was sitting in high-level meetings with venture capitalists, assuring them of the project's integrity, while knowing perfectly well there were no real houses being rebuilt. He provided the necessary corporate camouflage. And then there was my mother, Vivian was the one who gilded the entire rotting structure. While Mason forged the documents and Dean secured the leverage, Vivian controlled the narrative. I found internal emails coordinating her lavish charity events with the release of Mason's press statements. She was the one who wrote the tear-jerking speeches about a family reviving forgotten neighborhoods. She organized black-tie fundraising dinners where wealthy donors wrote massive checks, completely blinded by the dazzling smile of a prominent socialite. She constructed an impenetrable shield of philanthropy around a criminal enterprise. Who would ever dare to audit a family so deeply committed to the public good? I sat in the dark of my office, surrounded by printed pages of undeniable proof. My hands were shaking. I spent days trying to rationalize what I was looking at. I tried to convince myself this was just sloppy corporate governance, aggressive tax maneuvering, or a misguided business venture gone horribly wrong. I tried to cling to the absolute last shred of naive hope that my family was just greedy, not criminal. That fragile hope shattered completely on a Thursday afternoon. I was tracing the ownership structure of the final shell company, the one positioned to absorb the Savannah townhouse once I was out of the picture. I opened the digital incorporation charter to see who the acting manager was. My own name stared back at me. Right there, on the bottom of a fraudulent document designed to funnel dirty money through our family home, was an electronic signature mimicking my exact handwriting. They had forged my consent. They had made me an unwitting accomplice, a perfect fall guy if the federal investigators ever started asking questions. I was the quiet one, the exhausted caregiver, the perfect target to take the blame for the missing funds while they walked away clean. Suddenly, every single confusing interaction, every cold glare, and every impatient sigh over the last 3 years snapped perfectly into focus. The puzzle was complete. Their absolute desperation to get me out of the house had absolutely nothing to do with starting over or selling a valuable asset to pay off legitimate debts. They did not just want the property, they needed the property. The timeline on their fraudulent loans was running out. The federal audits were expanding. They needed to convert the historic townhouse into a vacant, completely clean, ready-to-trade asset to plug a massive hole in their collapsing scheme. And they could not do that with me living inside it, holding the keys, and answering the door. From that exact moment, sitting in the glowing hum of my office, a profound transformation took place inside me. The weeping, heartbroken daughter who just wanted her family to love her completely died. This was no longer a tragic story about a young woman betrayed by her neglectful parents and her arrogant brother. This was something entirely different. I was a woman looking at a sprawling, highly organized criminal syndicate that just happened to share my last name. They were using the beautiful facade of a respectable family and the tragic decline of a dying old man to camouflage a ruthless web of lies. They thought they had outsmarted everyone. They thought they had built an invisible machine, but they made one fatal, catastrophic error. They built their entire criminal empire using dirty paperwork, and they left it right in front of the one person who spent her entire life learning exactly how to read it. Contrary to the narrative my father aggressively peddled at his country club lunches, my grandfather was never confused during his final months. Dean loved to portray the old man as a fading, tragic figure, a mind completely lost to the ravages of age and illness. It was a convenient lie that allowed my parents to preemptively seize the moral authority over his estate in front of their wealthy peers. They needed society to believe he was incapacitated, so their eventual hostile takeover would look like an act of merciful administration. But the truth was a vastly different story. The physical body failing in that heavy oak bed was indeed fragile, but the intellect trapped inside it remained as sharp and unforgiving as cut glass. In the quiet hours of the night, when the rest of the world was asleep and the grand house settled into silence, he would talk to me. He did not ramble about the distant past or dwell on lost memories. He spoke with terrifying, clinical precision about property tax codes, generational wealth transfer, municipal zoning laws, and the complex legal liabilities surrounding his extensive real estate portfolio. He knew exactly what was happening outside his bedroom door. He could literally smell the desperation rolling off his own son and grandson. He understood the dark ambitions they harbored long before they ever dared to speak them aloud. The turning point happened on a hot Tuesday evening in late August, roughly 7 months before he passed away. The humidity outside was oppressive, pressing against the heavy window panes. Mason had stormed into the house unannounced, bypassing the formal greeting and marching straight upstairs. He paced relentlessly around the master bedroom, waving a thick stack of papers and demanding a signature on a document he claimed was just a routine, perfectly standard estate planning update. The argument that followed was low, bitter, and venomous. My grandfather flatly refused to sign anything. His voice was little more than a ragged, raspy whisper, but it carried the absolute weight of an undeniable command. Mason pushed harder, his tone turning desperate and threatening, revealing the frantic panic hiding just beneath his expensive suit. When he realized he was getting nowhere, Mason eventually threw his hands up in sheer disgust, muttered a vicious string of curses about stubborn old men ruining future progress, and slammed the heavy oak door so hard the antique crystal sconces mounted on the hallway walls vibrated. I rushed into the room immediately to check his medical monitors, fully expecting to find his heart rate skyrocketing dangerously. Instead, he was perfectly calm. His breathing was steady. He looked at me, his pale blue eyes remarkably clear and entirely devoid of fear, and told me to pick up the landline phone resting on the nightstand. He instructed me to call Naomi Pierce. Naomi was not the flashy, morally flexible corporate attorney my father kept on permanent retainer to clean up his messes. She was a brilliant, fiercely independent lawyer who had managed my grandfather's personal and business affairs for over 3 solid decades. She possessed a mind like a steel trap and knew the foundational legal history of the Savannah townhouse better than anyone alive, down to the original property deeds written over 1 century ago. She arrived the very next morning at exactly 9 o'clock, stepping through the front door with an aura of absolute authority. She did not come alone. She was accompanied by a quiet, incredibly serious man carrying a thick leather briefcase, whom she introduced as a senior fiduciary representative from an independent trust bank located 3 states away. They bypassed the parlor entirely, ignoring the luxurious downstairs rooms, and went straight up the sweeping staircase to the master bedroom. I tried to excuse myself, turning towards the door to give them privacy, assuming this was a highly confidential legal matter not meant for my ears. But my grandfather reached out and grabbed my wrist with surprising, desperate strength. He pulled me back. He ordered me to sit down on the small upholstered bench at the foot of his bed and listen carefully to every single word that was about to be spoken in that room. Naomi opened a massive file folder and began to speak in a hushed, deeply methodical tone that commanded absolute silence. She explained that the sprawling historic property we were currently sitting inside was no longer a simple, liquid asset. It had not been a liquid asset for a very long time. It was never going to be casually divided up, liquidated, and handed down through the generations like an antique pocket watch or a collection of old silver. Decades ago, anticipating the exact kind of vultures his descendants might become, my grandfather had quietly placed the entire estate into a highly specialized, fiercely guarded legal structure known as a conditional preservation trust. He had done this specifically to insulate the home from the reckless financial gambling and insatiable greed he saw festering in his own bloodline. The house belonged entirely to the trust, and the trust was strictly governed by an ironclad set of operational bylaws that neither Dean nor Mason even knew existed. They had spent years drooling over an inheritance that was already locked inside an impenetrable legal fortress. But what Naomi revealed next shifted the foundation of everything I understood about my future and my safety. Following my arrival as his full-time caregiver, and after quietly observing the utter callousness and subtle cruelty of his son and grandson over the past 36 months, my grandfather had directed Naomi to draft a drastic, highly classified amendment to those trust bylaws. He added a lethal, brilliantly constructed poison pill. The new stipulation was unequivocally clear and legally bulletproof. Any named beneficiary who attempted to use financial coercion, manipulated legal filings, forged housing documents, or initiated hostile, Deceitful actions to forcefully evict a lawful resident caregiver for their own personal gain would immediately trigger a catastrophic penalty. The moment such a hostile legal action was formally executed, that specific beneficiary would have their entire interest in the estate automatically and permanently suspended. There would be no warnings, no appeals, and no second chances. They would instantly lose absolutely everything they thought they were owed the very second they tried to play dirty. The mechanism went far deeper and was infinitely more dangerous than simply cutting an ungrateful child out of a standard will. It was actively designed to completely dismantle them if they chose to strike. Naomi explained that if the suspension clause was ever officially triggered, it would activate a devastating secondary protocol. A heavily sealed package of highly confidential documents currently sitting in a secure bank vault would be automatically unsealed and immediately dispersed. This package contained detailed historical financial statements, internal family memos my grandfather had saved, a comprehensive list of suspicious shell companies he had quietly been tracking alongside my own discoveries, and a sworn, notarized affidavit detailing his profound suspicions regarding Mason's fraudulent real estate ventures. The entire package would be formally handed over to the external trustee bank and an independent legal counsel for aggressive, mandatory review. It was a beautifully, ruthlessly designed dead man's switch. My grandfather knew he could not physically stop their criminal greed while he was lying in a hospital bed. So he built an invisible trap that would snap shut violently long after he was buried. Before Naomi and the bank representative packed up their briefcases that morning, they set up a small digital camera on a sturdy tripod at the end of his bed. My grandfather sat up as straight as his failing spine would physically allow, smoothed the wrinkles on his collar, looked directly into the lens, and recorded a final devastating video declaration. I stood in the shadowed corner of the room and wept silently, tears streaming down my face as I watched him speak. He did not sound angry or bitter. He sounded profoundly heartbroken and incredibly weary. He meticulously detailed exactly why he no longer trusted Dean or Mason to protect the legacy he had spent his entire adult life building from the ground up. He stated clearly, with a steady voice, that a family legacy was not just about accumulating prime real estate, hoarding capital, or boasting at charity dinners. It was about preserving the fundamental dignity of the vulnerable people who lived within those walls. He knew exactly what kind of hollow, ruthless men he had raised, and he was using his final precious breaths to legally and morally disarm them. When the camera was finally turned off and the lawyers left the house, my grandfather called me over to his side. He held my hand tightly in his frail grip and made me promise to fully understand what he had just done. He was not turning me into a wealthy heiress. He was not leaving me a massive pile of unearned money to run away with and start a new life. He had deliberately chosen not to make me the sole, outright inheritor of the entire estate, because doing so would have simply painted a massive, glowing target on my back and tied me up in vicious probate court battles for the rest of my natural life. Instead, he made me something far more powerful, far more untouchable. He made me the absolute key master. He granted me the exclusive legal authority to protect the foundational purpose of the property from the very people who shared our blood. He armed me with the only weapon capable of piercing their arrogant armor of wealth, manipulation, and high social privilege. Sitting in that quiet, sunlit bedroom, listening to the steady, rhythmic hiss of his oxygen machine, a profound sense of clarity washed over my entire being. I finally understood the incredible, terrifying weight of the gift he had given me. It was not just a shield of legal protection. It was a flawless, exquisitely patient mechanism for righteous retribution. I realized then that I did not need to spend my vital energy fighting them directly in the mud. I did not need to scream at them over the dinner table, or argue about fairness, or hire expensive lawyers to constantly block their aggressive, underhanded maneuvers. All I had to do was hold my ground and remain perfectly still. If the day ever came when my family decided to attack me using the wrong methods, if they ever let their arrogant, blinding greed push them to use dirty tactics or forged paperwork to force me out into the cold street, they would be the ones pulling the trigger on their own total destruction. they would activate the very mechanism designed to burn their empire to the ground. From that day forward, my role was no longer just a passive, exhausted caregiver enduring their insults. My role was to remain absolutely calm, keep my eyes completely open, and simply wait for them to press the button. The weeks following my grandfather's funeral were defined by a profound, suffocating silence inside the historic townhouse, broken only by the frantic, chaotic scrambling of my family out in the corporate world. My father had walked away from the graveside service fully expecting a rapid, entirely seamless transition of power and wealth. Dean anticipated a brief, highly agreeable meeting with a local probate judge, a few swift signatures on standard release forms, and the immediate, uncontested transfer of the valuable property deed directly into his primary corporate holding company. Instead, he collided violently with the absolute legal brick wall Naomi Pierce had so carefully constructed. The property was locked tight inside the Conditional Preservation Trust. Dean learned very quickly and very painfully that he could not casually sell the house to a developer. He could not leverage it to secure a commercial mortgage. He could not even legally represent the estate in a minor local zoning dispute without explicit or written confirmation from the independent fiduciary board located 3 states away. He was utterly furious, completely humiliated behind closed doors, but he was legally paralyzed. Outwardly, I did not escalate the conflict. I played the exact part they desperately wanted and expected me to play. I remained quietly inside the massive, empty house. I paid the exorbitant monthly utility bills out of my own modest checking account. I kept the original hardwood floors meticulously polished, and I maintained the sprawling front garden just as Amos had liked it when he was well. Whenever my parents dropped by unannounced, supposedly to inspect the premises but truly to intimidate me, I offered them nothing but weak smiles, lowered shoulders, and tired eyes. I let them believe I was simply a grieving, emotionally fragile woman clinging desperately to the fading ghosts of the past. I needed them to think my refusal to pack my bags was rooted entirely in pathetic, irrational sentimentality, rather than cold, calculated strategy. Mason, however, did not have the luxury of time to humor my supposed grief. His sprawling, entirely fraudulent development empire was beginning to severely fracture under its own massive, rotting weight. Through the highly secure informational channels Naomi helped me establish, I learned that my brother was drowning in invisible debt. He was desperately trying to secure a massive commercial bridge loan and finalize a complex debt restructuring agreement just to keep his various shell companies afloat for another quarter. But his private lenders were growing increasingly suspicious of his empty promises. They demanded solid, highly liquid, tangible collateral before they would release another single dime into his accounts. They needed the townhouse, but they needed it legally categorized as a clean asset, completely free of any current residence, holding periods, or legal encumbrances. As long as I was living inside that house, establishing a lawful residency and quietly paying the maintenance costs, the property was entirely useless to his financial survival. His sheer desperation began to bleed through his previously flawless, arrogant facade. While Mason sweated through his tailored designer suits, Naomi and I made our first silent, devastating move. We did not go to the local municipal police department, where my father had deep, entrenched political connections, expensive golf buddies, and favors he could easily call in to bury an investigation. We went straight into the federal labyrinth. We compiled a highly sanitized preliminary dossier containing the overlapping vendor addresses and the highly suspicious inspection photographs I had originally discovered at work. Naomi filed the thick packet through a deeply protected, heavily encrypted federal whistleblower program. It was a perfectly calculated drop. We provided just enough smoke to legally force the investigating agencies to open an active surveillance file, but we intentionally held back the absolute, undeniable proof. We needed the federal agents actively watching the board, tracking the wire transfers, and monitoring the communications, but we were absolutely not ready for them to flip the table just yet. Then, the universe handed me the exact weapon I needed to finish the job. It arrived in the form of a terrified, deeply exhausted man named Eli Mercer. Eli was Mason's former chief financial officer. He had abruptly resigned from the development firm exactly 6 months prior, officially citing vague, stress-related health issues. The absolute reality was that Eli had discovered exactly what I had discovered, but he had seen it from the inside of the machine. We met late one evening at a brightly lit, completely unremarkable diner on the far outskirts of the city, miles away from any restaurant my mother's wealthy social circles would ever frequent. Eli slid into the cracked vinyl booth, looking like a man who had not slept a full night in half a year. His hands trembled as he held his coffee mug. He was completely terrified of my father's vast influence and my brother's explosive temper, but his crushing fear of serving 20 years in a federal penitentiary for financial crimes he did not commit had finally outweighed his corporate loyalty. Eli did not come empty-handed. He pushed a thick, heavy manila folder across the sticky diner table. Inside was a complete, unedited, entirely raw copy of the shadow ledgers Mason had systematically forced him to manipulate. I spent 3 solid hours sitting in that diner, drinking terrible lukewarm coffee, tracing the long columns of numbers with my index finger. The sheer scale of it was breathtakingly brazen. The fabricated material expenses recorded in Eli's backup ledger perfectly matched the exact dollar amounts of the fraudulent government reimbursement claims I had previously flagged at Marrowfield Recovery Services. It matched down to the very last cent. The loop was entirely closed. I now held the internal financial records proving my brother was actively stealing, and I held the external government files proving exactly where he was stealing the money from. I could have completely destroyed them right then and there. I could have handed the manila folder directly to Naomi, authorized the final, unredacted whistleblower release, and safely watched the federal indictments roll in from the quiet security of my office desk. But I deeply understood the highly dangerous psychology of the people I was dealing with. My family possessed vast, liquid financial resources and an army of aggressive defense attorneys. If I attacked them from the outside, while they were still on their guard and feeling powerful, they would simply tie the evidence up in grueling, endless procedural litigation for 10 straight years. They would viciously attack Eli's character, claiming he was just a disgruntled, unstable former employee seeking petty revenge. They would hire experts to claim my findings at work were purely circumstantial accounting errors. I needed something far more concrete than matching spreadsheets. I needed them to commit a fatal, undeniable felony in broad daylight, a crime tying their massive financial fraud directly to their malicious, personal intent against me. I had to let them continue to believe I was completely defeated. People utterly blinded by their own towering arrogance always make their most catastrophic, life-ruining mistakes when they are absolutely convinced they have backed their prey into a dark corner with no possible route of escape. I needed to stand perfectly still, lower my head, and let them build the gallows entirely by themselves. The final, fatal piece of their elaborate trap fell right into place on a crisp, deeply cold Tuesday afternoon. My cell phone vibrated loudly on my office desk. The screen displayed Vivian's name. I let the phone ring exactly 3 times before I finally answered, consciously making sure to inject just the right amount of hesitation, submission, and emotional weariness into my voice. My mother spoke with a sickeningly sweet, entirely synthetic warmth that made my skin crawl. She did not ask how I was doing. She did not ask if I was still grieving the loss of her own father. She simply announced, in a tone that brokered absolutely no refusal, that Dean was hosting a grand Thanksgiving dinner at their new estate, and she insisted that I attend. She flawlessly pitched the invitation as a generous olive branch, gently suggesting that it was finally time for the entire family to put aside our recent, unfortunate tensions, heal our minor emotional fractures, and sit down at the table to talk like civilized adults. I listened to the smooth, highly practiced, completely hollow cadence of her voice, and I felt a cold, sharp smile spread slowly across my face. I knew exactly what this phone call actually was. They had entirely exhausted their polite, informal requests. Mason's vital bridge loan was likely expiring within a matter of days. They needed me physically out of the historic townhouse immediately, and they knew they entirely lacked the legitimate legal authority to do it through the Preservation Trust. They had clearly resorted to creating their own dirty, forged paperwork, and they desperately needed a very public, very humiliating stage to serve it to me. They truly believed the sheer, suffocating social pressure of a crowded dining room filled with their wealthy peers would force my immediate, tearful surrender. I did not argue with her. I did not ask for a private, quiet meeting instead. I told my mother, keeping my voice soft and perfectly compliant, that I would be absolutely delighted to attend her holiday dinner. I agreed immediately because I knew with absolute certainty that they were desperate for a public performance, and I was finally ready to give them one they would remember for the rest of their ruined lives. The dining room was not simply decorated for a holiday meal. It was meticulously staged by my mother as a theater of absolute victory. Vivian had ordered the domestic staff to polish the heavy antique heirloom silver until it gleamed like weaponry under the light of a dozen towering white wax candles. The floral centerpieces were excessively tall, designed specifically to force the carefully selected guests to look upward, reinforcing a subtle psychological dominance over the entire room. Every single person sitting at that long, polished mahogany table had been expressly invited to serve as an unwitting juror and a compliant witness to the final transfer of power within the Carter family. The air smelled of rich roasted meats and heavily spiced wine, but underneath the luxurious aromas, the room was suffocatingly tense. My father did not slide the thick cream eviction notice across the table out of sudden anger or a momentary lapse in social etiquette. Dean was a man who calculated every single public breath he took. He positioned himself at the absolute head of the table, commanding the attention of the room before he made his move. He deliberately delivered the legal document in front of these highly influential community members because he required their pristine social reputations to validate his cruelty. He needed them to testify, if ever asked by a judge in the future, that I had been treated with absolute civility and given proper formal notice. He wanted a captive audience to watch him formally sever my emotional attachment to the property. He truly believed that if he humiliated me in front of the local financial elite, I would be far too paralyzed by shame to mount any kind of legal defense. He thought the sheer weight of public embarrassment would crush my will to fight. From directly across the table, my brother could not contain his desperate, greedy relief. Mason actually raised his crystal wine glass in a silent, entirely premature toast to his own perceived brilliance. A thin sheen of nervous sweat coated his forehead. He took a deep, greedy swallow of the expensive vintage red wine, his dark eyes locked intensely onto the envelope resting beside my dinner plate. In his deeply arrogant and fractured mind, the grand game was already officially won. He firmly believed that my immediate, forced departure from the estate would instantly cure his catastrophic financial hemorrhaging. He thought that forcing me out into the cold winter night would magically satisfy his private lenders and finalize the massive commercial bridge loan currently collapsing under his feet. He was silently celebrating his own salvation, entirely blind to the executioner standing right behind his chair. I did not raise my voice. I did not give my family the satisfying, hysterical reaction they had all gathered to watch and mock. I simply looked down at the thick piece of paper resting on the wood. My eyes bypassed the grand, intimidating legal threats printed in bold letters and focused entirely on the microscopic administrative details. I saw the fraudulent blue notary stamp, a sloppy detail I had immediately recognized from my daily work. But then I looked much closer at the physical envelope itself and the fine print at the bottom of the page. I saw a faint, distinct watermark pressed deep into the expensive paper stock. I read a tiny alphanumeric internal tracking code printed along the very bottom right edge of the document. My breath went completely still inside my chest. My heart pounded a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. That specific sequence of letters and that exact watermark design did not belong to a legitimate local law firm. They did not belong to the county clerk. They belonged to a highly obscure, completely fabricated shell vendor. It was the exact same fake printing vendor listed hundreds of times in the fraudulent federal reimbursement files I had backed up at my office. It was the very same fake corporate entity Eli Mercer had highlighted in yellow marker inside his hidden financial ledgers. In that singular, breathtaking moment of supreme arrogance, my father had unknowingly committed legal suicide. By printing a domestic eviction notice through his hidden criminal network and officially serving it to me in front of half a dozen wealthy independent witnesses, he had effectively welded his petty family dispute directly to a massive federal fraud conspiracy. He had brought the poison directly into the house. I slowly lowered my hands beneath the heavy linen tablecloth. I unlocked my cellular phone by touch alone, feeling the familiar glass screen under my thumb. I opened a blank message directed to the secure number belonging to Naomi Pierce. I did not type out a long, dramatic explanation of the evening. I typed exactly 6 words. He used the exact same paperwork. I hit send. I slid the phone back into my pocket and finally looked up at my father. He was smiling. It was a benevolent, sickeningly patient smile. He opened his mouth, drawing in a breath to deliver a perfectly rehearsed, condescending speech about familial duty, business necessities, and moving forward toward a brighter future. He never spoke a single word of it. A massive, deafening impact struck the solid oak front door of the historic townhouse. The sheer physical force of the blow was so incredibly intense that the heavy antique picture frames hanging in the grand foyer violently rattled against the expensive wallpaper. A second, even heavier blow immediately followed, completely shattering the heavy wooden frame and splitting the heavy deadbolt right down the middle. The polished, perfectly controlled dining room instantly descended into absolute, screaming chaos. The tall wax candles flickered wildly and blew out as a sudden rush of freezing cold night air swept through the grand hallway. Men and women wearing heavy tactical gear, dark windbreakers, and utility belts flooded into the opulent entryway. The federal agents did not ring the doorbell. They did not ask for polite permission to enter the premises. They moved with terrifying, coordinated precision, fanning out across the entire first floor of the house in a matter of seconds. The lead agent, a tall woman with cold, entirely unsympathetic eyes and a heavy-duty metal clipboard, marched directly into the dining room. She did not introduce herself politely. She loudly and forcefully announced the execution of a federal search warrant. She explicitly authorized her team to initiate the immediate seizure of all personal cellular devices, corporate project files, offshore banking ledgers, encrypted storage drives, and any physical assets tied directly to the Carter Family Development Network. The wealthy donors and private lenders scrambled backward in sheer terror, their heavy wooden chairs scraping violently against the polished hardwood floor. My mother dropped her wine glass. The expensive crystal hit the edge of the table and shattered into 100 pieces, splashing dark red wine across the pristine white linen tablecloth like fresh blood. Mason froze completely in his seat, his face draining of all color until he looked like a corpse, his raised glass still hovering uselessly in the air as 2 armed agents stepped directly behind him. My father jumped to his feet, knocking his own chair backward. His face flushed a dark, furious, pulsating red. He pointed a trembling, manicured finger at the lead agent and screamed at the top of his lungs. He demanded to know who authorized this outrage. He yelled that they had absolutely no right to interrupt a private, sacred holiday meal. He desperately tried to control the narrative one last time, screaming that this was simply an internal family matter, a minor legal misunderstanding over an inheritance, and he aggressively demanded they leave his property immediately. The lead agent did not flinch. She did not step back, and she did not raise her voice to match his frantic panic. She looked down at the forged eviction notice resting peacefully beside my dinner plate. She picked it up, glanced at the fraudulent vendor code at the bottom, and then looked directly into my father's wide, panicked eyes. Her voice cut through the screaming room like a blade of solid ice. She told him, slowly and clearly, that the situation ceased to be a simple family matter the exact second he decided to forge federal financial documents using this very house as his primary tool. The rage shattered the Thanksgiving dinner, but it did not immediately hand me the victory I had envisioned. When the federal agents finally marched out of the historic townhouse in the early hours of the morning, they left behind a suffocating, altered reality. Large sections of my grandfather's home, including the downstairs parlor and the formal study, were cordoned off with heavy evidence tape. All of our immediate domestic bank accounts were temporarily frozen by court order. By Monday morning, the local Savannah newspapers were already running deliberately vague but highly damaging front-page columns. They did not explicitly name the federal charges yet, but they aggressively whispered about a prominent, historical local family suddenly caught in the crosshairs of a major government investigation. The pristine Carter name was finally bleeding in public. However, my family did not collapse in a heap of remorse. The battle simply mutated from a sudden, violent ambush into a prolonged, incredibly sophisticated psychological war. My mother, Vivian, reacted to the catastrophe exactly as a seasoned public relations executive would. She felt absolutely no guilt over the forged documents or the stolen federal funds. Instead, she immediately launched a vicious underground damage control campaign. She spent her days having very quiet, very strategic lunches at the country club. She sat across from the most influential gossips in the city, dabbing her dry eyes with a silk handkerchief, and spun a brilliant, utterly toxic narrative. Vivian told anyone who would listen that the immense, crushing grief of losing my grandfather had completely broken my mind. She painted me not as a whistleblower, but as a deeply unstable, bitter daughter who was lashing out at her own loving family simply because she had been left out of the primary inheritance. She weaponized my years of quiet isolation and turned them into proof of my supposed mental fragility. Simultaneously, my father leveraged every single political connection and golf course friendship he had cultivated over the last 3 decades. Dean worked the phones relentlessly, desperately trying to reframe a massive, multi-million-dollar federal fraud ring into a petty, blown-up domestic inheritance dispute. He called the local district attorneys he had previously funded. He pressured the municipal judges he had campaigned for. He wanted the city's elite to view the federal raid as an embarrassing overreach by aggressive out-of-town bureaucrats who did not understand how local business was done. He even sent indirect messages to me through mutual acquaintances, heavily implying that if I simply dropped my end of the hostilities and retracted my statements, he would generously forgive my outburst to save the sacred honor of our family name. He genuinely believed that if he squeezed my social standing hard enough, I would eventually crack. Mason was granted a conditional release on bail within the first 48 hours, largely due to my father rapidly liquidating several untouched offshore assets to cover the massive bond. But my brother was not retreating to lick his wounds. He was completely out of his mind with panic. Through a private investigator, Naomi Pierce had quietly retained on my behalf. We tracked Mason's immediate movements upon his release. He did not go to his lawyer's office, and he did not go home to sleep. He drove straight to a private marina on the eastern edge of the city. He was frantically trying to access a rented storage locker down by the docks. He was searching for a specific encrypted hard drive and a digital cold wallet holding heavily laundered cryptocurrency. In his fractured reality, he firmly believed that recovering those hidden digital assets would somehow magically save his sinking corporate empire from total bankruptcy. A year ago, I might have driven down to that marina myself. I might have confronted him on the wooden docks, screaming and demanding answers, trying to force him to feel the profound shame he deserved. But I had completely stopped playing by the rules of emotional family drama. I did not confront him. I did not shed a single tear. I simply picked up the phone, called Naomi, and gave her the exact address of the marina, the locker number, and the time of his arrival. Naomi instantly relayed the geographical coordinates directly to the lead federal investigator. I let the authorities handle my brother. I let the law wrap tightly around his neck, while I remained completely detached. While my mother poisoned my reputation and my brother chased digital ghosts, I continued digging through the chaotic aftermath inside the townhouse. The federal agents had missed a small, locked mahogany humidor tucked away on the top shelf of my father's closet. I broke the brass lock open with a hammer and found a stack of heavily redacted bank correspondence. Reading through the crisp pages, I uncovered a terrifying new layer to their scheme. Dean had not just forged the eviction notice to get me out of the house. 3 months prior, he had submitted a completely fraudulent corporate resolution to a private wealth management firm, attempting to open a massive, unsecured line of credit directly against the Preservation Trust. The eviction notice on Thanksgiving was never a spontaneous act of cruelty. It was merely the second crucial step in a heavily premeditated, multi-stage plan to entirely drain the estate's value before the fiduciary board ever realized what was happening. The most agonizing part of this new reality, however, was fighting the war on two entirely separate fronts. The federal government was slowly building a devastating criminal case against my family, but the municipal wheels of justice moved at a completely different, stubbornly blind pace. Because my father had successfully filed the fake eviction paperwork with the county clerk before the raid occurred, the legal demand for my removal still actively existed in the local court system. I was technically still fighting a ticking clock to avoid being forcefully removed by the county sheriff. I had to spend my mornings sitting in a sterile, fluorescent-lit municipal courthouse with Naomi, filing endless injunctions and presenting the federal search warrants just to prove the eviction order was entirely based on a criminal forgery. Then, I had to spend my afternoons walking through the historic district, feeling the cold, burning stares of my neighbors. I could hear the whispers stopping the exact second I entered a coffee shop. I could feel the heavy, suffocating weight of Vivian's smear campaign isolating me from the community I had lived in for years. They looked at me like I was a traitor, a vicious daughter who had destroyed her prominent, respectable parents out of pure, unadulterated spite. The narrative had completely shifted. This was no longer a simple story about a loyal caregiver getting her rightful revenge on a neglectful family. The satisfying, explosive climax of the raid had faded, replaced by a grueling, incredibly exhausting war of attrition. It became a brutal test of endurance. It was a question of whether a single woman possessed the sheer psychological fortitude to stand absolutely firm while her personal reputation was dragged through the mud and the very roof over her head remained in a terrifying, legal gray area. My family was wounded, heavily bleeding, and completely exposed, but they were still breathing. And a cornered predator with nothing left to lose is infinitely more dangerous than one who still believes he is the absolute king of the jungle. The deepest wounds inflicted by my family did not come from their loud, public declarations of war. The most lethal strike was the one they had meticulously sharpened in the dark, far away from the blinding lights of the federal raid. While my father raged against the local judges, and my brother scrambled to hide his digital assets, my mother maintained her flawless facade of a grieving, deeply wronged matriarch. But Vivian's polished armor cracked from the absolute last direction she ever expected. My next unexpected ally arrived silently on a dreary Thursday afternoon. Her name was Claire Holt. For the past 12 years, Claire had been Vivian's indispensable personal assistant. She was the woman who organized the charity galas, managed the endless guest lists, and drafted the moving speeches my mother delivered to tearful audiences. Claire was entirely invisible by design, a quiet shadow taking meticulous notes in the corner of every opulent room. But even shadows have a breaking point. Claire had simply grown entirely sick and tired of typing beautifully polite words to cover up actions that could not be described as anything less than pure evil. We met in the back of an independent bookstore across town. Claire did not waste time with pleasantries. She handed me a heavy leather tote bag containing a thick stack of printed email drafts, internal fundraising scripts, and most importantly, a prepaid cellular device my mother used exclusively for her private coordination. Scrolling through the messages on that cheap, plastic screen, the absolute myth of Vivian Carter's blissful ignorance completely disintegrated. She was not a passive wife looking the other way while her husband and son committed financial crimes. My mother was the active, brilliant architect of their humanitarian disguise. She had personally drafted the fake operational timelines. She had explicitly instructed Mason on which specific charitable buzzwords to use to bypass the federal grant review boards. But the printed emails contained a revelation far more venomous than her complicity in the real estate fraud. Buried in an exchange between my parents was a secondary contingency plan, so unbelievably malicious it made the Thanksgiving eviction notice look like a mere slap on the wrist. I discovered that throwing me out of my grandfather's house was only the first half of their intended punishment. Once I was homeless and legally severed from the estate, Dean and Vivian planned to utterly destroy my professional career before I could ever mount a legal retaliation. They had carefully co-authored an anonymous complaint addressed directly to the executive board of Marrowfield Recovery Services. The letter was a masterpiece of character assassination. It falsely claimed that I was illegally accessing highly sensitive, classified federal data from my office computer to extort my own wealthy family for a larger inheritance. They were going to frame me as a rogue, criminal employee, ensuring I would be immediately terminated, stripped of my professional credentials, and likely prosecuted. They wanted to sever my income, destroy my credibility, and leave me completely destitute, ensuring no judge or investigator would ever believe a single word I said. I did not wait for their ticking time bomb to explode. The very next morning, before the local post office even opened to process the mail, I voluntarily walked straight into the executive boardroom at Marrowfield Recovery Services. I sat down with the regional director and the head of our internal compliance division. I laid out the entire situation with absolute, unflinching transparency. I presented my officially documented, federally protected whistleblower registration. I showed them the exact timestamp channels I had used to report the fraud with Naomi Pierce. By exposing the truth first, I completely neutralized my family's preemptive strike. When my parents' anonymous letter inevitably arrived at the office 3 days later, it did not trigger a catastrophic internal investigation against me. It was immediately flagged as a malicious act of retaliation and handed straight over to the federal prosecutors to be added to their mounting pile of evidence. My parents had tried to bury me alive, and I had simply handed the authorities the shovel they used to dig the grave. The final, heartbreaking turning point in this sprawling war arrived via another woman who had narrowly escaped the Carter family's toxic orbit. Tessa Rowe was Mason's former fiancée. She was a brilliant architectural designer who had genuinely fallen in love with my brother, firmly believing in his passionate speeches about building equitable, dignified housing for the marginalized. She had broken off their engagement abruptly 6 months ago and moved out of the state, an event Vivian loudly blamed on Tessa being unable to handle the intense pressures of high society. The truth was much darker. Tessa flew back to Savannah silently and asked to meet me in Naomi's secure law office. She looked exhausted, carrying a heavy burden of guilt. She handed over a solid-state backup drive she had secretly copied before packing her bags. Tessa explained that she had discovered Mason was using highly manipulated spreadsheets and phantom building materials to cover up construction sites that had never actually been completed. He was pocketing the federal money meant for the walls and the roofs, leaving the physical structures completely hollow. Naomi connected the drive to her secure terminal, and we opened the project files. One specific folder caught my eye, and what I saw inside completely shattered whatever remaining restraint I held toward my blood relatives. One of Mason's primary flagship projects, the one Vivian had used to secure hundreds of thousands of dollars in private donations, was a low-income residential facility designed specifically for elderly citizens with limited mobility. The financial ledgers falsely claimed that $500,000 had been spent upgrading the heating systems, reinforcing the roof, and installing medical-grade accessibility ramps. Tessa's hidden site photographs revealed the agonizing reality. The money had been entirely siphoned off. The elderly residents were living under an actively leaking roof. Their central heating system was fundamentally broken, leaving them to freeze during the winter months. The accessibility ramps were made of cheap, rotting wood that violated every single safety code in the city. My brother and my parents had stolen from the poorest, most vulnerable people in our society. They had lined their own luxurious pockets with the money meant to keep fragile grandmothers and grandfathers warm and safe. I thought about my own grandfather, Amos. I thought about the 3 years I spent carefully managing his oxygen and ensuring he lived his final days with absolute dignity. My family had watched me do that grueling work, And then they had turned around and actively condemned dozens of other elderly people to suffer in freezing, rotting buildings just so Mason could afford another custom-tailored suit and Vivian could host another lavish dinner party. Sitting in that law office, staring at the photographs of those broken, forgotten homes, something fundamental shifted permanently inside my soul. My core motivation completely evolved. This bitter war was no longer just about preserving my grandfather's historic townhouse. It was no longer about proving to my arrogant father and cruel brother that I could outsmart them. This was no longer a personal family grievance. I wanted to completely tear down the entire rotting system of hypocrisy they had built. I wanted to expose the smiling, wealthy monsters who drank expensive champagne while actively profiting from the absolute helplessness of the weak. I was going to use every single weapon my grandfather gave me, not just to defend my home, but to burn their fraudulent empire completely to the ground. The federal evidence files grew from a few manila folders into towering stacks of banker boxes, and my father abruptly shifted his entire survival strategy. Dean was a man who understood the cold mathematics of a sinking ship. He realized with terrifying clarity that a blanket denial was no longer a viable defense. The paper trail was simply too dense, the testimonies from Eli and Tessa too utterly damning. So, without a single shred of paternal hesitation, Dean decided to throw his only son directly into the fire. He transitioned from outraged innocence to a sickening display of cooperative transparency. He scheduled private meetings with the federal prosecutors, adopting the deeply sorrowful persona of an aging patriarch who had been completely blinded by a father's love. He aggressively painted Mason as a reckless, greedy rogue actor who had manipulated the family's pristine corporate infrastructure to run a massive fraud entirely behind his back. Dean was perfectly willing to let Mason serve 20 years in a federal penitentiary if it meant he could secure a quiet immunity deal and walk away with his own freedom intact. But Dean knew his fabricated defense still had one massive, unpredictable liability. He knew I held the missing pieces of the puzzle. Late one Tuesday evening, my father requested a highly confidential meeting. We did not meet in a lawyer's office or a public restaurant. He ambushed me in the dimly lit parking garage beneath Naomi's building, stepping out from the shadows of a concrete pillar. He looked older, his tailored suit hanging a little looser on his frame, but his eyes were still burning with that same arrogant calculation. He offered me what he boldly called a family compromise. He promised to formally withdraw the municipal eviction order. He promised to sign a legally binding addendum to the Preservation Trust, guaranteeing my absolute uncontested right to live in the historic Savannah townhouse for the rest of my natural life. In exchange, he asked for a minor favor. He just needed me to officially recant my whistleblower statements to the federal investigators and quietly lose the backup ledgers I had acquired from Eli Mercer. He wanted me to testify that I had been confused by the complex accounting software at work. I stood in the cold, echoing garage, and stared at him in complete disbelief. It was the most profoundly insulting offer of my entire life. Dean truly believed that my entire crusade, the agonizing months of investigation, the sheer terror of the federal raid, and the heartbreaking realization that they had stolen from the elderly, was all just a petty negotiation tactic. He thought I was just throwing a tantrum because I wanted a free house. He was treating justice, accountability, and the suffering of vulnerable people like a cheap bargaining chip in a real estate transaction. I did not even dignify his offer with a verbal rejection. I simply turned my back and walked to my car, leaving him standing alone in the dark. Upstairs in the brightly lit office, Naomi Pierce was methodically preparing for a brutal, two-front war. The legal battles were converging into a massive, simultaneous collision. On one side, we had the upcoming municipal probate hearing regarding the property and the administrative control of the trust. On the other side, the federal criminal proceedings were rapidly entering the plea agreement phase. Naomi was a maestro conducting a symphony of destruction, ensuring that every piece of evidence we submitted to the local judge was flawlessly synchronized with the federal indictments. While Naomi built her impenetrable legal fortress, I sat quietly in the corner of her office and finally opened the very last sealed envelope my grandfather had left for me. Amos had entrusted this specific letter to Naomi, with strict instructions that I was only to read it when the final battle was entirely unavoidable. I carefully broke the wax seal and unfolded the thick paper. His handwriting was shaky, a stark visual reminder of his failing health, but the words were incredibly sharp. He wrote that he knew my father and my brother would eventually force my hand. He knew the burden he had placed on my shoulders was unimaginably heavy. But the most crucial sentence in the entire letter fundamentally shifted my perspective on the impending war. Amos wrote that if the day ever came where I had to choose between preserving a beautiful, historic building and preserving the righteous purpose of that building, I must always choose the purpose. He reminded me that the townhouse was just wood, stone, and antique glass. The true legacy of the Carter family was not the physical property, but the dignity and protection it was supposed to provide. That single, profound realization severed my final emotional tether to the brick and mortar of the estate. I stopped entering the final stage of this war with the desperate mindset of a woman trying to keep her house. I no longer cared about owning the mahogany dining table or the antique crystal chandeliers. My only remaining goal was to categorically prove that the historic townhouse could never again be used as a financial weapon by the very people who exploited its legacy. The next morning, Naomi called me to her desk with a triumphant gleam in her eye. She had spent the entire weekend digging through the massive dump of financial records seized during the Thanksgiving raid. She had found the fatal, undeniable link that would completely destroy Dean's attempt to play the innocent victim. Naomi traced the specific payment invoice for the printing of the fraudulent eviction notice. The exact order for that thick cream envelope and the custom watermark had been paid for via a direct wire transfer. That transfer originated from the exact same shell vendor bank account used to funnel the stolen federal reimbursement funds. Dean had used the stolen government money to pay for the fake legal document he used to evict his own daughter. The two crimes were now legally, undeniably fused together. The situation escalated exponentially 3 days later, when the federal investigators finally cracked the security on the storage locker Mason had desperately tried to access at the marina. The contents of that locker completely obliterated my father's defense strategy. Inside a heavy metal safe, the agents found the physical, custom-made rubber notary stamp used on my eviction notice. They found thick stacks of blank municipal inspection forms, already pre-signed by the fake corporate directors. They found a series of digital hard drives, containing the raw, unedited photographs of the low-income housing projects before they were digitally altered to look repaired. But the absolute nail in the coffin was not a digital file. It was a physical, leather-bound accounting ledger kept entirely in my father's distinct, cursive handwriting. Dean had been meticulously recording the exact cash distributions from the shell companies, tracking exactly how much stolen federal money was being routed into his own offshore retirement accounts. He was not a blind, trusting father manipulated by a rogue son. He was the chief financial architect of the entire criminal syndicate. The walls were completely closing in on them. They had absolutely nowhere left to run, no politicians left to bribe, and no fake charities left to hide behind. The reality of their impending destruction finally broke my mother's flawless facade. Vivian ambushed me outside the municipal courthouse on a rainy Thursday afternoon, just days before the final trust hearing. She looked completely shattered. Her expensive designer coat was soaked from the rain. Her perfect hair was ruined, and her makeup was running down her cheeks. She grabbed my arm, tears streaming down her face, and delivered a desperate, pleading apology. She begged me to remember that we were a family. She pleaded with me to speak to the local judge and ask for leniency, claiming she simply could not survive in a federal prison. She tried to use the exact same emotional manipulation she had employed my entire life, banking on my deep, desperate need for her maternal love to save her own skin. I stood in the freezing rain and looked directly into my mother's eyes. For 34 years, I had craved her approval. I had allowed myself to be treated like a ghost, a servant, and an inconvenience, all because I was terrified of losing the only family I had. But looking at her now, trembling and begging on the wet pavement, I felt absolutely nothing. The fear was completely gone. I pulled my arm firmly out of her grasp. I did not scream at her, and I did not offer her a single word of comfort. I simply turned around and walked up the heavy stone steps of the courthouse, realizing with absolute clarity that this was the very first time in my entire life I was truly, completely unafraid of losing them. The final decisive confrontation did not happen in the shadows or through anonymous letters. It happened in the vast, incredibly imposing central courtroom of the federal building, a room lined with heavy oak panels and lit by massive, unyielding fluorescent lights. The presiding judge had agreed to an unusual, highly accelerated joint session, combining the municipal probate ruling on the preservation trust with the initial sentencing phase of the federal criminal case. The two intertwined nightmares were finally going to be resolved on the exact same afternoon. Dean Carter walked through the heavy wooden double doors of the courtroom wearing his most conservative dark charcoal suit. He moved with the slow, practiced, entirely unbothered grace of a man who still completely believed his own mythology. Even after the federal raid, the frozen accounts, and the damning evidence, he remained firmly convinced that his decades of carefully cultivated social capital would act as a magical shield. He sat at the defense table, leaning slightly forward, his hands resting calmly on the polished wood. When it was his turn to speak, he adopted the soft, trembling voice of an aging, deeply exhausted father. He looked directly at the judge and spun his final, desperate lie. He painted himself as a naive, overly trusting man who had simply been swept up in the aggressive, modern ambitions of his young, reckless son. Vivian sat right behind him in the front row of the gallery, playing the perfect supporting role. She wore a simple, unadorned black dress, staring down at her lap, perfectly projecting the image of a devoted wife who only ever handled the polite, social paperwork and had absolutely no genuine understanding of her family's complex financial architecture. I sat at the plaintiff's table next to Naomi Pierce. I did not glare at my parents. I did not interrupt my father's pathetic performance with loud, angry objections. I simply waited my turn. When I finally stood up and walked to the podium, I brought nothing but cold, undeniable mathematics. I did not speak about my broken heart or the emotional abuse I had endured. I walked the judge through an agonizingly detailed, chronological timeline. I presented the exact dates of the forged signatures, cross-referencing them with the specific wire transfers originating from my father's hidden accounts. I systematically demonstrated exactly how they had attempted to weaponize the historic townhouse, turning my grandfather's sanctuary into a crucial, load-bearing pillar for their sprawling, intentional federal fraud scheme. Then, Naomi stood up and delivered the first killing blow. She approached the bench and formally submitted the encrypted video file Amos had recorded on that hot August morning. The massive screens mounted on the courtroom walls flickered to life, and suddenly, my grandfather's face looked down upon the silent room. His voice, raspy but filled with absolute, uncompromising authority, echoed off the high ceilings. He looked straight into the camera and stated, with devastating clarity, that he was granting me the absolute administrative control of the Preservation Trust. He explicitly clarified that he was not choosing me because I was weak, obedient, or easily manipulated. He chose me because he knew I was the only person in his bloodline who possessed the moral fortitude to protect the true, foundational value of the estate from the vicious, consuming greed of his own son and grandson. The judge, a man known for his incredibly low tolerance for white-collar deception, did not hesitate. He ruled immediately from the bench. He legally declared the Thanksgiving eviction notice completely null and void. He struck down every single fraudulent corporate resolution Dean had attempted to file against the estate. And then, he explicitly activated the lethal poison pill Amos had so carefully designed. He formally stripped Dean and Mason of all their remaining conditional beneficiary rights. They were permanently, legally exiled from the Carter estate due to their documented use of coercion and forgery to seize control. The room barely had time to process the magnitude of the probate ruling before the lead federal prosecutor stood up to deliver the final strike. The prosecution laid out a seamless, unbreakable chain of physical and digital evidence connecting the local family dispute directly to the massive federal conspiracy. They presented the printing receipts from the shell vendor, the forged notary stamp recovered from the marina safe, the internal emails detailing Vivian's public relations cover-up, and finally, the meticulously handwritten cash ledger detailing Dean's offshore accounts. The sheer, overwhelming weight of the evidence finally broke the weakest link in the chain. Mason, sitting at the far end of the defense table, completely shattered. The arrogant, visionary developer devolved into a terrified, sobbing child, desperate to shave even a few years off his impending federal sentence. He turned entirely on his own father. Mason stood up in open court and loudly confessed that the entire Thanksgiving eviction stunt had been Dean's explicit master plan. He admitted that Dean deliberately handed me the forged document in front of those specific wealthy guests to artificially generate a verified public timestamp. They needed independent witnesses to prove to their private lenders that the house was actively being cleared, a desperate, final requirement to finalize a massive, fraudulent commercial loan that very same night. Vivian sat completely frozen in the gallery, the carefully constructed armor of her genteel, Southern charm evaporated into thin air. I watched the few remaining wealthy socialites and country club friends who had bothered to attend the hearing slowly quietly stand up and slip out the heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom. They abandoned her the exact second her toxicity became public record. She was left sitting entirely alone, surrounded by empty wooden benches, finally forced to stare directly at the absolute, naked truth of her own ruined life. The final disposition of the estate was settled that afternoon. The historic Savannah townhouse did not become a luxury condominium development. It did not become a trophy asset in my brother's fake portfolio, and it did not fund my father's offshore retirement. Following the strict, explicit guidelines established in my grandfather's trust, and with the full approval of the independent fiduciary board, the property was legally restructured and reborn. It was formally christened the Harbor Lantern House. It became a fully funded, short-term respite center and a dedicated legal advocacy clinic specifically designed to support exhausted family caregivers and protect vulnerable elderly citizens facing the exact same kind of predatory housing displacement my family had attempted. I became the permanent executive director, running the foundation exactly as Amos had intended. 1 year later, on the evening of Thanksgiving, I sat at the head of that exact same long mahogany dining table. The antique crystal chandelier cast the same warm, golden glow across the room, but this time, the chairs were not filled with wealthy donors, corrupt lenders, or people who shared my last name out of sheer, toxic obligation. The table was surrounded by the incredible people who had chosen to stand with me when the lights went out. Naomi Pierce sat to my right, laughing loudly at a joke Eli Mercer was telling from across the table. Tessa Rowe sat next to him, pouring wine for the dedicated staff members of the new foundation. The heavy cream envelope that had once been intended to destroy my life was no longer a symbol of deep, agonizing betrayal. It was securely framed and hanging in my downstairs office, serving as the ultimate, undeniable proof of the exact day I finally stopped being a silent, enduring victim and stood up to become the absolute keeper of the gate. Thank you so much for listening to this story today. I would love to know where in the world you are tuning in from. So please drop a comment below and let's share our thoughts together. Please remember to subscribe to the Maya Revenge Stories channel, leave a like on this video, and if you really enjoyed it, hit that hype button to help push this story out so even more people can hear it.